Hmm. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Colleen Gallagher podcast. We are a top 400 spirituality podcast with the intention to be a space that you can come and tune in to receive a frequency that will activate, educate, and empower you to begin living a lifestyle you love that supports you financially. If you're returning, oh, hey. And if you're brand new, well, hello and welcome. Spirituality became a passion of mine because I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer at age 14. And after 9 long years of suffering, I self-healed my body, mind, and soul. So in these episodes, I bring you my own voice, as well as people I meet along my journey to offer perspective, inspiration, and real life proof that when you choose to follow your dreams, you say yes to what is inside of your heart, that you will begin to create a lifestyle that is wildly impactful, fulfilling, and abundant beyond your wildest dreams. We cover topics from health and wellness, digital marketing, new age spirituality, global development, and pop culture current events as it relates to the Great Awakening. So get ready, tune in, subscribe, and make sure to leave us a review to let us know what you're loving. You can always email us on my website, www.colleengallagher.co, to request episode topics and let us know how everything's going. I love you and thank you for being part of this collective community. I'm so excited for the day I get to meet you and give you a hug. And so with that, you guys, I'm super excited to introduce to you episode 125, How to Turn Trauma into Self-Empowerment with Chad Gaines. Chad was born on June 3rd of 1973. He's an author and a speaker, and he is widely known for his book, Who Am I? And after you get to know him, you're going to see why. The details of his horrific child abuse that he endured as a young boy. He spends much of his time doing lectures, coaching on PTSD and long-term effects. Gaines is now a coach about the concepts of resilience. In 2001, his mother killed his stepfather, and he writes the details in his books based on his Who Am I? In 2004, Chad was honored as one of the 10 most outstanding young Americans in the country. In 2008, Gaines was honored with the Daily Points of Light by President of the United States, George Bush. In 2020, Hollywood writer Stevie Long wrote the movie script based on Gaines' life, filming the movie Pocket of Hope that will take place in San Francisco, California in the summer of 2023. Chad has appeared on many podcasts around the world sharing his story and message. Keep getting back up. And so with that, welcome, Chad.
Hey, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me today. Nice meeting you.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have this community have access to you and your story because my third book was called An Uncompromised Life, How to Overcome Trauma and Overcome Pain and Trauma and How to Experience the Unexplainable to Truly Fall in Love with Life. And so I want to kind of start with your story to tell us a little bit about your dad abandoning you at a very early age, experiencing child abuse, and your mom killing your stepfather, and how this really began to influence and shape your future.
Yes, it's a completely bizarre story.
That's to say the least.
In 1979, my father and I were out fishing. I was just a young boy, and in that area in the Midwest, Chicago, Indiana area is where I grew up. 1979, it was very common to leave the kids down at the lake and just go about your day and do your thing. Wasn't like the world we live in now.
Mm-hmm.
But on that particular day, my dad was fishing with me, and he left to go into the little smaller town where there's a grocery store, because we didn't even have a grocery store in our town.
Oh my gosh, wow.
And he just decided that day he just never came back. And he just left the family, left me without any warning or any explaining, just left the family. Back up a little bit, my father was a truck driver, and he hauled for Kit Kat candy bars from Indiana to New York City twice a week, back and forth. In the 70s and into the early 80s. Leaving the family, things drastically changed. I was the only child in my family between my father and my mother, which was probably a downside for me, because she took all that anger from my father leaving, the abandonment, having an only child that she didn't want in the first place, to a level of abuse that was recognized as torture in that state, where we actually, at one point, we had to flee from that state because she was under investigation for child abuse.
Wow.
So it was a pretty humbling beginning for me. The abuse took a drastic turn when I was about 7 to 8 years old, when it went from the mental abuse was about not looking at my mother. I wasn't allowed to look at my mother because that was a sign of disrespect. So I could never look at my mother in the face, or I would have to face the consequences of that. But in the beginning, the slaps and the humiliation was in the beginning, even in public. It was a time that we lived in where if something like that was going on, you didn't look at it. It wasn't your business, so you didn't get in it.
Yeah.
Now we obviously have awareness and that we can reach out and tell somebody if we see something, say something,
Yeah.
which is a great concept. But in the beginning, it was just that, and I assumed, because I was the only child, that was normal. That was a normal parenting child relationship, until it got to the age of about 8 or 9, and then things went more physical, with anything from broken bones to stabbing, set on fire by the grill, potentially, from my mother. All these things contributed to the PTSD that I suffer from today.
Wow.
I get a lot of questions of like, at what point in your life, Chad, did you decide and know that you were going to write a book about your story? And I told them, and my answer has always been, I was probably about 7 years old when I knew that I was going to write a book, because this was just something that I realized wasn't normal, because I did have a friend that down the street that I would go over to his house and see his parents, see mom and dad, and he had 2 twin brothers. And I would see they're not getting treated like I am. And I just knew something was different.
Different.
My outlet was going to school when I was able to. A lot of times I would be punished from going to school because I would either have bruises, or I would have to stay home and do dishes or laundry. And if those weren't finished on time by the time she got home, then it would be, severe beatings, and more of the physical abuse, and mental. It was more physical and mental for me.
And I think what's really important to like say in your story, because I think a lot of people don't, maybe they're not attuned to this, but like with interpersonal relations, especially the bond with our family when we enter in this world of like not knowing as a child to kind of ask for what we need, or what are the agreements we need to feel loved and appreciated. And so I think it's really powerful how early on you really experienced abandonment with your father, and what that feeling of abandonment, and we'll get into PTSD, doesn't just leave you. It carries over in many other relationships, with fear of a relationship always leaving, or fear of our career, and paranoia. Like there's a lot that it would bring into our lives, which I want to just highlight there for anyone listening. And abandonment is a very interesting experience in the ways that it trickles out in different habits in our life and self-protection mechanisms. And the abuse, like you're sharing with mental and physical, like not being able to look at your mom as like a form of, like disrespect, that really loses a lot of like intimacy, or being able to even read cues or signs of kind of emotional intelligence, like being able to read what's going on in a room or what's happening with someone. And so, I guess my question, because I mean, you knew really early on at 7 that you wanted to write a book. And so I guess how do you feel like maybe from 7 years old when you had this idea came to you of like, okay, my life is happening and I now know that this life is going to be a book. How do you feel like this really shaped as a young child, like ways that you interacted with the experiences you were having?
Um, wow, there's just so much to that question. Um, First of all, I would have to say because of the abuse, a lot of people don't realize it carries over to your adulthood.
Yeah.
And I've heard all the things that was 40 years ago. Why should that bother you now? And unfortunately, it affects me every single day throughout my day. It's affected me majorly in relationships
Yeah.
because the only two people that were basically assigned to take care of me and love me and keep me safe abandoned me and betrayed me.
Yeah.
So the trust issues that caused, as now is almost a 50-year-old man, it affects me more now than it did then because I wasn't aware of what was happening and the effects of that. I was
Yeah,
never
like the
told.
subconscious coping mechanisms and the habits, and especially because it happened so early for you, like the developmental years of your life, habits of relating and protection mechanisms to like not let people get close to you so you don't have to feel that pain, or like I said, just
Absolutely.
emotional cues. So it's really fascinating. And I wanted to kind of go into, I guess the next question it segues into is kind of after experiencing this, what was like the moment that something switched when you knew there was more for your life? Like what was like that moment after experiencing this trauma and after like it's kind of, oh my God, like how like coming into a place of realizing that it wasn't normal for what was happening to you. And then like when was that moment that things switched of like a different life was possible?
I think for me, it was the biggest attack on me from my mother. I think that's what it was. I was 9 years old. And that summer was just different. It was just
Mm,
different than all the summers. Like she seemed like a different person
mm,
where for the first time in my life, I was seeing my mom smile and like having a good time and joking around with people. I was like, who's this person? I love this. And then I remember the summer, I for some unknown reason, I was allowed to go out to my friend's house down the street, and we always played like wiffle ball in the backyard back then, and those good times. And I remember coming home, and in my house, you could see from his house. It was that close. And
got
as I
it.
was walking down the sidewalk, I could see my mom outside on the back deck where there was a grill and she was grilling. And we had never used that grill. It was like, wow, what's happening here?
Yeah.
And I remember walking in through the house, going out to the back deck and just seeing her smile and cooking this food, which she never hardly cooked at all. And it was just bizarre. And then it was just like you said, that switch where she picked up a butcher knife and began to stab me in the arm and stab me in the hand. And, just the shock of like how this was going to end for me because I never seen myself living to be 18 years old. Never,
Wow.
never in my life did that cross my mind. Um, but I think it was the stabbing part. And then on top of that, calling my grandmother saying, this is what I just did. Uh, do you think I should take him to the hospital?
Wow. And that was like the moment that just kind of opened you to like there was more.
Yes. And I think it was because they were one of the same person. They were very violent like that.
Yeah.
And my grandmother just simply said, no, don't take him. So that's what happened. They just kind of butterflied my wound together and uh, hope for the best. It was never clean, nothing. I still got the scars. I'm 50 years old, and I see those. And now I have a 7-year-old daughter that asked one time when I was wearing a short sleeve, Dad, what happened there? How do you go back after this tragic, horrendous life and explain to your 7-year-old daughter that, hey, this is what grandma did, you know?
Yeah.
so there's a long-term effect that is just affecting 8 million people a year
Wow.
from this. Every year in America, they suffer from PTSD, and most of them do it silent because of the guilt that it causes. Caused me severe guilt,
Yeah.
severe trouble in my finances, to relationships, to the way I think, the way I see. Isolation at one point in my life, where I lived 3 years alone in this very small, tiny room, probably as big as your bathroom. And I was just comfortable living the rest of my life there and dying there because I didn't feel anything was uh, worth it. I was
Wow.
just so thankful that I lived through all this to even come on a podcast and share it, let alone to write a book and then have a Hollywood writer come and say, like, this is so bizarre that I want to write a movie
Script on
screenplay
it.
about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're gonna get into that, but the thing that I wanted to share that just kind of it still blows my mind is like I mean, in the belief system that I share on this podcast is I believe that our life has experiences happen through us so that we can begin to create and offer solutions to other people's life as part of our purpose and part of our destiny. And it's just pretty crazy how your life was laid out, like with abandonment to, abuse to murder. Like it's just like a very crazy, almost like what's it called, like thriller crime movie. Like
Right.
starts out and you're
Exactly.
like, is this like real? So I can't
Exactly.
even really, like, it's hard to even imagine putting yourself in that scenario because it's almost so polarizing and contrasting to what a lot of people experience. But the things that I do feel like many people experience, which they can relate to, is the abandonment, is the isolation, is not feeling loved and rejected, and PTSD in various forms with relationships, maybe not at the extreme you experienced it at, but those feelings arising and how we create coping mechanisms that are hindering us from living the most incredible life. And so I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your new book, The Change, and
Sure.
insights into self-empowerment.
Sure. This is the Change book. I got the first copy right here, which is going to be saved for my daughter, obviously. But wow, what a great read. Wow, so many people collaborated in this book to bring insight to just overcoming obstacles, to my story, to just so many great, the winner of The Voice telling his story, and just so many great business people that do coaching that have been through it and just know what it's about. And I'm just thankful. I'm featured on the cover with Les Brown. He does the
Amazing.
forward of the book.
Yeah.
One of my favorite motivational speakers of all time.
Yeah,
Uh,
he's incredible.
so that's out now, obviously.
And go ahead.
And they came to me a few months ago,
Mhm.
um, and wanted me to be a part of the Change book because they heard my story and they said, can you write your story in our book? And I said,
Yeah.
of course. So there's so many great opportunities out there. But in the beginning, it was very difficult to speak about. That
Yeah.
was my biggest challenge, even though I knew at a certain age in my teenage years that I was called to speak about my story. Many days I don't still want to do it because I don't want to say it's embarrassing anymore because this is what I do and I know I'm called to do it, but it's very humbling. It's very humbling because there is an opposite side to that story of my dad and
Mhm.
my mom and all those things that took place. But also the ending was, are you going to get closure or not?
Mm.
If they die, are you going to get the closure you need to continue on with your life? You know, I was asked that and I couldn't answer it because I didn't know. I didn't know where my father was. I didn't
And that's it.
know
Okay.
um, how it was going to end with my mother. She was never going to admit anything. And then it got into more of a mental game as I got older.
Yeah.
It was Chad, can you come over to my house? And I
Yeah.
would go over there and she would say, mental games. This is what she used to do, for instance. Uh, hey, I lost my ring. Can you help me find my ring?
Yeah.
And we would be looking around her house for hours for the ring that she had hid somewhere to make me believe that it was missing and I needed to find it. Those type of things. Or when I
Yes.
got home, she would call and say, did you take my ring?
And what's crazy about what you're saying, because I think this is like what I shouldn't say crazy, I said amazing about what you're saying is like this closure piece of, will I have closure when they die? And will I be able to feel resolved and healed from this experience? Because these people who harm me or endured or inflicted trauma on
Sure.
me, are they even going to have the emotional capacity to offer me what I need? And I think that's a really important thing in any, not just with this type of relationships, but any relationship in general. And so the question that I kind of had to lead into is, why do you believe self-empowerment is so important? And how do people who have experienced trauma in their own ways begin to take steps toward changing their life?
Well, I think the main thing for me, I believe that obviously we're all here for a purpose, no matter what that is. It could be little, it could be big, however you interpret it. But I believe with all my heart that we're here for a purpose. And I believe strongly that I'm here for this purpose. If anything else, maybe not to write books or to have a movie or anything like that, but just help people not be so afraid.
That's
That
a
that
really big line.
that's my biggest goal in my whole life. Whether if I live another day or if I live another 20 years, that's what I've always wanted since I was probably since I was 28 years old and got the phone call that from my mother that I think I just killed your stepdad. Uh, and thinking back now, I think like out of all the people she would call first before 911, before she called me
Mhm.
to put that on me, to put
Yeah.
that guilt on me. And then it always came back to, will you ever get this closure? Will you ever get this closure you need from your mother? Will she say, hey, I'm sorry, all this took place? This is just anything. Will I ever get closure from my dad? You know, I thought.
And
And
so on
then
the journey, I guess the thing I want to say is like, when you had these things and you're on the journey to self-empowerment, like when these happening, these questions are arising in you of like fear or closure, like how did self-empowerment, or you feel like this journey of doing that, how did it help?
I think it was a motivation for me.
Mm,
In the beginning, it was just like, I'm going to do the opposite of everything my mother did. I'm going to
yeah.
do the opposite of everything my father did. And I only had two pictures of my father, but I studied those pictures throughout my degree in psychology because I wanted to know why my mom and dad did what they did. So I even got a degree in psychology just based on that. Guess what? Didn't teach me nothing. Didn't teach me the reason why they did what they did.
Wow.
So it was more for me in the beginning. It was a motivational thing. Like I
Got it.
want to be different. I studied the picture of my dad holding me when I was 5 years old before he left. So I grew up as a man. I even combed my hair to the opposite side of what my dad did, just to be different, because I
Mm,
didn't want any of those things to haunt me in my future.
wow.
But the thing about PTSD and the trauma, I didn't have a choice. It did affect me, and I
Yeah.
did a lot of things that they did. You know,
Well, yeah, it's
as
habits,
I
and
got older.
it's habits that we, like you said, or like I said earlier, like we take on, and very early at 7, 8 years old, you would have already have, I can even imagine how many coping mechanisms of doing whatever you had to do to just not be
Exactly.
hurt, not be seen, not take up too much space. Like, reading other people's energies that are highly active and reactive nervous system,
That
and
was
like how,
definitely my thought
yeah, like, and
at the
like at a
time.
young age, you're not realizing cognitively that's what you're thinking. But as you get older, you begin to look at yourself. And I feel like that's why I believe this journey of self-empowerment is so important, because I can relate when I went through my abortion and I was in a relationship that was I was an emotional codependent. He
Mm,
suffered with narcissism. Like, when I was experiencing that, like I had to realize all the ways of why I was an emotional codependent. And when I began to do that, it's like taking my empowerment back, like being empowered. It guided me to such a peace, and it guided me to such a freedom, where kind of what you're sharing, these thoughts of like closure, these thoughts of what's going on or whatever, it didn't take up my mind or disturb my peace or my center as much anymore. And I feel like that's kind of with you, like you being able to sit here and openly have dialogue about this without there being like shame, or without there being guilt. And with you doing it so or authentic, it's like that's when you took your power back, because it wasn't something that was living inside of you that you were struggling with, but it's something that you, like, it's living with you and it's breathing through you as you can influence and help other people, which I think is why I believe self-empowerment and looking at your journey is so important.
Thank you. I for me, having the PTSD level that I do, guilt and shame has always been the biggest thing. Maybe I've not showed it. It's one of those things you adapt to, you try to cope with it, but it's always there. I wake up with it. I go throughout my day with it. I go to sleep with it. It's something that I just recently, bless you, came to terms with, that it's never going to go away. PTSD will never go away. There's no cure. There's different ways that you can deal with it and manage it. But the feelings of guilt, the feelings of waking up and saying, you know, Chad, and maybe this is my mother's voice, Chad, you're not worthy to have a book like this. You know, you're not worthy to have a book written about your life that's going to be turned into a movie. So all those things are very important to understand, that they're never going to go away. You can have all the closure you want, but the guilt and shame that they made you feel when you were 7 years old is going to remain when I'm 50, when I'm 60, whenever I'm gone. It's just a part of it. So I just come to terms recently. It took me like 4 decades, 40 years to realize, like, okay, this is what I am, but I have to separate it because I'm called to share my story. So maybe, just maybe, a few people out there can use a part of my story to help them grow and have this, you know, closure and self-empowerment to continue on. At first in my life, like I said, it was the motivation. And then as I got older, it shifted just a little bit. It shifted about 10 years ago to, okay, now what I have to do is I just have to outlive them. And then it disappears, right? It disappears, right? If you can outlive them. And then they both died. My mom and dad died. And then I'm left with this, like, it didn't go away. It just shifted another way. What we do is we just shift it to over here. We manage this part, and then we just shift it to somewhere else. It's the same thing with all the addictions that I've been through that caused this in my teens, you know, drinking and hardcore drugs, to going to prison for a year of my life. And that's where I really got the self-empowerment to say, I don't want to live like this no more. I want to learn, I want to study, and I want to be a different person. And I came out of prison in 2000, the year 2000, 23 years ago now. And I decided for the first time in my life, I want to share my story. And
How powerful.
2 weeks after I was out of prison, I was invited to speak at a church. And I shared my story in front of people that I terrorized at one time through fighting and trouble that I was in. And now I'm facing them. I'm facing them on stage. There's 247 people. I've never shared my story a day in my life. And now I'm coming to terms with what I did, but also what they did. And it was very rough. It was probably the scariest point in my life, even through my childhood, to go back and face the people that they once knew you as a troublemaker, and the background of your family being very violent. And the biggest thing that ever happened to me was at that event, when I spoke at that church, there was a pastor and a professor in the first row. The professor asked me, I would love you to share this story at our university. I'm a professor. And I told him, wherever I'm asked to go, I will go and share this story. That was my deal in prison that I made with God to turn my life around. If you give me one more chance, I'll go wherever you want me to go. And I lived in a population at that time of 500 people. Okay. Since then, I have been to every state in America, other than Alaska, which we have a plan to go to Alaska this year. I've been able to speak on stages as large as 6,000 people. But my second event where that pastor invited me to, and I said I'd go wherever I was called to go, just happened to be the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, one of the biggest and best colleges in America.
Yeah.
I was asked to go on stage at the Joy ACC where they play basketball and speak in front of 4,000 students. My second time. And that's where I was introduced to basically college, because at that time, before this, back up just a minute, before I made it to the 5th grade, I had already failed 3 times in elementary school. Couldn't read or write until I got to the 5th grade because of child abuse. I missed so many days. So at that time, when I got out of prison, I didn't have a college degree. I had a GED, basically, and was going with no knowledge how this works, how college works. And I went up on stage. I spoke in front of these 4,000 kids. And then I went home and thought, okay, it was nothing. This was awesome that I actually got paid. You get paid to do this? They paid me to speak there. And but 2 weeks later, I had 500 emails from all over the country, and I couldn't understand. Like, I don't know anybody in Arizona. I don't know anybody in Montana. Like, what's going on? And then the guy that the pastor and the professor, I called them in a frantic, and they said, well, what you don't understand is everybody that goes to the University of Notre Dame doesn't live in South Bend, Indiana.
Yeah, they live all over.
I just assumed, because I never had been in a college a day in my life.
Yeah.
And they told me, no, what happened was we put your email on the scoreboard. All those students went back home and told their brothers and sisters, you got to have this guy share his story in your middle schools and high schools. And it just took off like a rocket.
Wow.
A rocket. Once I mentally agreed, I'm going to go wherever I'm called to go to share my story. It was just, I went all over America.
And what's interesting is what I love that you shared. It's like, it just happened organically, but you just were like trusting your story and trusting yourself. And especially when you got out of prison, you were like, I made this decision and this is what was going to happen. And I think there's so much power in our decisions. And I always say, like, your career, your success, or your love, it's never a question of if it's going to happen. It's just when are you going to decide it's going to happen? And so I love that you really showed that, because the power of that decision is so important. And so kind of to wrap this up, I had 2 other questions that we'll go through. And so one, I was going to say, if you could just offer one piece of advice to someone out there who is now experiencing trauma or has experienced trauma to support them in beginning to experience self-empowerment and transformation, what would it be?
I think for me, because I do coach and speak about PTSD and also self-worth, because that has a lot to do with PTSD, but it has a lot to do with other things.
Yeah.
So it's not tailor fitted just to PTSD people. I would say for me, routine is everything.
Okay.
If I don't have a routine, I will fail, and I will even cancel all my calls for the day.
Yeah.
Because I am just done. So I think that's a very important. Number 2, I would say surround yourself with people that are building you up. I know that's easy to say, but surround yourself with people that are building you up and not tearing you down. That's the most important thing.
Totally.
That we should live and die by.
Yeah.
Because I put myself in those positions through relationships and all those tough times. And that was the biggest thing that I recognize now where I'm at is through the self-empowerment is routine and the relationships that you build and the people you hang out with.
Yeah,
You know,
I agree. I think
it's
one thing I
everything.
think I've learned with what you shared, and I think it's really important, is really being mindful, like you said, the people you're around. And if anyone around you is bringing you down, you have to let go like immediately. And even though
Have
it's the
to.
hardest thing
It
sometimes,
is the hardest thing and it
what
hurts.
and what you brought up, which I think is most important, is because we're not going to get closure of why that person's acting that way or why they're doing that. We're not going to get that closure. We're not going to have that opportunity because that person's not in a space, but it's not our responsibility to sit there and like bring them up, because everyone has to be on their own journey and want it themselves. So I think that's really powerful what you shared. And also, I think even looking at what you went through, like they were never going to be able to offer you the closure required for your healing. It was something you had to choose anyway. And it is the hardest part, but
Very hard,
I'm
very
grateful you
difficult.
shared that. And I think there's so much you gave in here of how to begin just thinking of that and just offering your story as a testament that it's possible for things that people, can't even imagine, let alone out of a movie. Like, it's something you don't even think is real, and your life
Right.
was kind of painted that way. And so I definitely recommend everyone to make sure they go get the change, make sure they get your book, Who Am I, to read more about it, and to make sure they are on your mailing list, on your website, which I think is Chad or gainschad.com.
Gainschad.com. Yep.
And the other thing I would just say, is there anything else you want to share, offer, where people can connect with you as we wrap up?
I do want to end in the closure part, because we touched on that so many times. And like I said, I was asked that. I was probably 34 years old when I was asked by a counselor, Chad, if your mom and dad die, what will you do if you don't get the closure? I never thought about it up until then, but in closing, I can say this. 32 years after my dad left, he came back in my life. And I got the closure that I needed for him. He told me why, how, and what took place that led him to leaving the family and starting a new family.
Yeah.
That's exactly what he did. He had a girlfriend in New York, had an affair, began a family, and she was pregnant. He didn't know what to do. And he chose whether to stay with our family or leave, and he left.
Yeah.
32 years later, he came back in my life and explained all that, and it was just like it gave me closure that I needed. 32 years out of my life, he came back into my life for 32 days and had a heart attack and died. Wow. But it was just the timing of the closure and explaining and humbling himself. I've seen this man transform into somebody that I've never seen before. It was just this great transformation to see this old, broken down man being humble. He got to see me speak. He got to hear some of my story, and it was just amazing ending. Unfortunately for my mother, it wasn't the ending that I wanted. Mm-hmm. I tried to make amends and trying to say that I forgive her, and it was kind of denied. Yeah. Through my grandmother. She refused to talk to me and just basically said that, he's not my child, and when I die, he won't even be in the obituary. And that was correct. That was correct. So I think there's the guilt and shame will always stay because of that. I'll feel that. But the self-empowerment of, like, my mom died in 2017 and it still bothers me. Why? Yeah. Is there. And I think it really comes down to a great support system. Surround yourself with great people. Yeah.
I agree. I think the most important thing that I hope for you guys listening to take away, and even with my third book, like I say, when I talk about how to overcome heartbreak and trauma, it's just important to know, like you shared, it's not that it necessarily goes away. It's just the way that you interact with it and the coping mechanisms you've developed they become healthier and they become, like you said, transferred in a more productive way than a self-harming
Yes.
way.
Yes.
So, and then if you want to leave just some information of where people can find you, where they can connect with you, so that way they have that, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sure. Just Facebook, Instagram is Gaines Chad, my website where you can get this book and also order my book, Who Am I, based on my life, is gaineschad.com also.
Perfect. And we'll have that in the show notes for everyone. So we're so grateful for your presence, Chad, and your time, and definitely just grateful for who you've chosen to become on this journey, because there's many people who've experienced what you have and aren't able to come out on the other side of
Sure.
reframing their mind and reframing their life and reframing their habits. So it's a really powerful story that I'm grateful this audience gets to hear and connect with you on. So I love you guys. Make sure to check him out, get his books. I know I'll definitely be getting the Who Am I one and reading The Change. So you guys are going to want to get it too.